The government decided how many children you could have. Not suggested, not taxed, decided. And the question everyone asks is, how could a government do that? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what does a government have to be looking at to conclude that this is the only option left? Because in 1980, China's planners were staring at a number: 430 million new people added in 30 years. No additional farmland, no new water, the same soil, feeding a population that had nearly doubled, with infrastructure built for half of it. And one of the men in that room said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, "Prepare to be cursed for a few years. It's better than our descendants having nothing to eat." That sentence is not the voice of tyranny. That is the voice of a system that has already decided what it is willing to sacrifice. Today, we decode what that system is and why it is still running. Here is the argument. The one-child policy was not an act of authoritarian impulse, not a government drunk on control, reaching into the most private corner of human life because it could. It was a system, making a calculated trade-off. Specifically, a civilization whose operating system has always prioritized collective survival over individual freedom, running that logic at maximum pressure, under conditions of genuine resource collapse. In the previous episode, we watched the Keju examination system deploy the same subroutine. When the system detects existential threat, it forces mandatory institutional intervention to prevent collapse. The Keju broke hereditary power to stabilize governance. The one-child policy broke the population curve to stabilize resources. Different input, same code logic. What you are about to see is not a story about a government that went too far. It is a story about a system that ran exactly as designed and produced both the dividend and the damage that such a design makes inevitable. Both of them, fully, without one cancelling the other out. The numbers first, because the numbers are not background. They are the argument. In 1949, China's population was approximately 540 million. By 1979, 30 years later, 970 million, a net addition of 430 million people. To feel the weight of that, you added twice the entire population of the United States to a country whose agricultural infrastructure had not fundamentally changed since the Qing dynasty. And the trajectory was not slowing. The fertility rate in 1963, at the height of the post-famine recovery, reached approximately 6 births per woman. Even by 1979, after a decade of softer campaigns, it still sat at 2.8. The system was running a population growth algorithm it could not afford. Now, the person who ran the actual calculation. Song Jian was not supposed to be the person who changed this. He was a missile engineer, a control systems theorist trained in the Soviet Union. Population dynamics were not his field. In 1978, he attended a conference in Helsinki and encountered Western population modeling for the first time. He came back to China and ran the numbers himself, not as a demographer, but as an engineer who modeled the trajectories of objects under force. His cybernetic models projected that if China maintained its then current fertility rate of 2.2, the population would breach 1.3 billion by the year 2000. By 2020, 1.5 billion, and per capita arable land, already critically low across multiple provinces, would fall below the minimum threshold for basic grain self-sufficiency. He presented his findings to the State Council in 1979. The room was not unanimous. This was not a decision that felt clean to the people making it, which brings us back to that sentence from the beginning. Chen Yun, one of the most senior economic planners in the party, reportedly framed the dilemma in internal discussions with a directness that cuts through all subsequent debate. Prepare to be cursed for a few years. It's better than our descendants having nothing to eat. That is not the language of a man who believes he is doing something righteous. That is the language of a man who believes he is doing something necessary and who knows the difference between those two things. But the policy did not arrive fully formed. The system tested softer versions first. In 1971, the campaign was called Wan Shi Xiao. Later marriage, longer spacing between births, fewer children overall. Voluntary, persuasive. The fertility rate did fall, from 5.8 in 1970 to 2.8 in 1979. The model said it was not enough, so in September 1980, the party issued an open letter addressed to all party members and Communist Youth League members. The letter asked them to voluntarily commit to one child, and it announced that this commitment would become national policy. The soft version had been tried, the system upgraded. And here is where the enforcement mechanism reveals the code logic most clearly. The policy operated through Yi Piao Fu Jie, the one veto system. If a local official's jurisdiction failed to meet its birth quota, that official's entire performance record was voided. No promotion, no bonuses, no recognition, regardless of every other metric they had achieved. You did not punish the parents directly from Beijing, you punished the official who failed to prevent the birth, and you let the official figure out how. Research estimated that this incentive structure, the official accountability mechanism, explained approximately 46% of the fertility decline observed through the 1990s. The system did not rely on belief. It did not rely on persuasion. It restructured the incentive landscape of every administrator in the country and let the pressure cascade downward. This is the same architecture the Keiju used to break aristocratic power, the same architecture the Danwei work unit system used to enforce social compliance. China's operating system does not issue commands from the top and hope for compliance. It rewires the incentive structure and lets the system optimize itself. The one-child policy was not a command, it was a parameter change. And this is where it gets interesting. What did the policy actually produce? By compressing the birth rate, China engineered a specific window in its dependency ratio, the proportion of non-working age people to working age people. In 1982, that ratio was 62.6%. By 2010, it had fallen to 34.2%. That window, roughly 30 years, is when manufacturing employment exploded. From 50 million workers in 1980 to 120 million by 2010. Annual growth rate, 9.5%. The one-child policy did not cause China's economic miracle alone, but it created the demographic architecture inside which that miracle became possible. Now, the savings mechanism, because it is precise and it matters. Economists documented a specific pattern across Chinese households. Families with a single child maintained savings rates of approximately 21.3%. Families with twins, same income, same era, same region, saved at 12.8%. The difference was not culture, not Confucian thrift. It was structural pressure. A family with one child knew, with mathematical certainty, that this child would eventually carry 4 grandparents and 2 parents alone. The Yi structure, 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. The anxiety of that arithmetic drove savings up. Those savings became investment capital. That capital became factories. Those factories became the export engine that pulled 300 million people out of poverty. This is the system's intended output, and for the window it was designed for, it worked. Now, the comparison that reframes everything. In 1950, China and India had comparable population sizes. India faced the same pressure, the same resource constraint. the same demographic trajectory bearing down on the same insufficient farmland. And India's operating system arrived at a different answer. Individual reproductive rights are inviolable. The state cannot reach inside that decision. Democratic process protects that boundary, not because it is efficient, but because it is foundational. You do not cross it, not even for survival. The result, India's population continued growing. The demographic dividend China harvested across 30 years, India has not yet fully collected. This is not a verdict. India is not wrong. China did not win. What it shows is this: two civilizations facing an identical resource constraint ran different code and produced different outputs. The difference was not capability, not intelligence, not development. It was the location of one boundary line. Where does the individual end and the collective begin? Western liberal systems draw that line at the body. The state cannot reach past it, not into reproductive choice, not into the most intimate decisions of a person's life. That boundary is not negotiable. It is the foundation on which everything else is built. China's system draws that line at the survival threshold of the collective. When the system approaches collapse, no domain is outside the optimization mandate. The body is a variable. When that variable threatens systemic failure, the system overrides it. Neither of these is a universal truth. Both are code choices, and both produce exactly the outcomes their logic predicts. The Western choice produces a system more resistant to state abuse of intimate life, but structurally slower to respond to collective emergencies that require individual sacrifice. The Chinese choice produces a system capable of mobilizing collective resources with extraordinary speed, and it produces, with equal predictability, the institutional pathways for exactly the abuse that occurred. Forced sterilizations, late-term abortions, the systematic disappearance of girls from birth records. These were not implementation failures, not local officials going rogue, not the policy being misunderstood at the provincial level. They were the predictable output of a system that decided collective survival outranks individual autonomy, and then handed enforcement to local officials with career-ending incentives to hit their numbers, with no institutional flaw on their methods. The code ran. It produced what code of that design produces. Now look at what the system is doing today. In 2015, China ended the one-child policy and permitted 2 children. In 2021, it permitted 3. By 2023, multiple provinces were offering direct cash payments, extended parental leave, and tax deductions for families with multiple children. The Western narrative calls this a reversal, a policy failure, an admission that the whole thing was a mistake. That framing is looking at the wrong thing. The system did not reverse, the input changed. From population surplus to population deficit. From a dependency ratio that was dangerously high to one that is now collapsing in the opposite direction. An aging population, a shrinking labor force, a pension base with no one to fund it. The optimization target recalibrated. The same institutional machinery that once suppressed births is being redirected to incentivize them. The same official accountability structures are being retooled, this time to reward fertility increases in underpopulated regions. Chen Yun's logic was always technical, not moral. Better to be cursed now than to starve later. When later arrives with a different crisis, the system applies the same reasoning. Opposite direction, same code. This is what version control looks like at civilizational scale. And it tells you something about China's current behavior that political analysis consistently misses. When Beijing announces a new demographic target, a new industrial policy, a new infrastructure mandate, it is not making an ideological statement. It is not performing strength for a domestic audience. It is running a parameter update on a system that has been solving collective survival problems for 2,000 years. The policy changed, the operating system did not. I want to stay with the counter-argument longer than is comfortable, because the strongest version of it is not simply that this policy was cruel. That is true, but it is not the hardest version. The hardest version says this: the entire framework I have been using, civilizational logic, operating system, trade-off, parameter change, is doing something dangerous. It is making the suffering abstract. It is converting forced sterilizations and infanticide and the systematic elimination of girls into variables in an equation. And in doing so, regardless of intent, it provides intellectual cover for state violence against women's bodies. I have been sitting with that objection for a long time. I do not have a clean answer to it. What I can say is this: naming something a trade-off does not make it acceptable. It makes it legible. And legibility is not the same as justification, even when it can be misused as one. The women who were forcibly sterilized were not victims of a policy that went wrong. They were victims of a policy that worked exactly as its incentive architecture was designed to work. Local officials, under career-ending pressure to hit birth quotas with no institutional constraint on their methods. The violence was not a deviation from the system, it was the system, at the point where the system had no flaw. That is a specific failure, identifiable, structural. Not, the goal was wrong. Not, the civilization's logic is illegitimate. But, the enforcement mechanism contained no minimum protection for the individual body. No institutional check on how local officials achieved their targets. The system optimized, and it optimized all the way down to the most vulnerable people inside it, with nothing to stop it. That is the bug, and naming it precisely, rather than condemning the entire operating system as barbaric, is what allows you to ask the question that actually matters going forward. Can a system that optimizes for collective survival be redesigned with better flaws? Now, you might be thinking, that question is itself a form of accommodation. That asking how to make this system more humane is already accepting that this kind of system should exist. And that is actually a fair point. But here is what that argument misses. This kind of system already exists in every civilization that has ever faced genuine resource collapse. The question is not whether collective survival logic will be deployed again. The question is whether, when it is, there are institutional constraints on how far it reaches. That question is not hypothetical. It is arriving. The real question is not whether the one-child policy was right or wrong. Every serious analyst already knows that answer is both. At the same time, that is what a trade-off is, when it is real and not theoretical. The real question is this: we are entering a century in which every civilization, not just China, will face resource constraints that demand collective responses. Climate, water, food systems, aging populations. The mathematics of planetary limits do not negotiate with political philosophy. When those constraints arrive, when the resource equation becomes the emergency, every system will face the same calculation China faced in 1980. How much of the individual do you override to save the collective? Western liberal democracies have an answer written into their code. China has a different answer, one it has been running, updating, and paying the costs of for decades. Neither answer is finished, but one of them has already been stress-tested, at a scale of 1.4 billion people, under conditions of genuine existential pressure, with the full results now visible. The factories built, the poverty reduced, the labor force that powered a generation of growth. And somewhere in the gap between those numbers and the policy that produced them, there are women whose names we don't have, whose choices were not choices, whose bodies were the price the system paid and did not ask permission to pay. Both of those things are true at the same time, without one cancelling the other out. You now have the full output. What you do with it is the question that matters. If the logic behind the one-child policy, a system overriding individual variables to prevent collective collapse, made you reconsider how China approaches governance itself, the next piece of that puzzle is China invented blind review, 900 years before Silicon Valley. Link in the description.